Okay, welcome back everybody. I have the honor to introduce tonight's keynote speakers to you. Chibuike Uche from the University of Leiden. He's the Stephen Ellis Professor for the Governance of Finance and Integrity. He has written extensively on the history of money in Nigeria and colonial West Africa. One of the articles that I would like to highlight is British Interests, Oil in the Nigerian Civil War. And he's also dealt extensively with how banking systems under colonialism worked and did not work, and worked to the detriment of the African population. I'm very honored that you came here today, and we're very much looking forward to your talk. Daniela Gabor is Professor of Macrofinance at the University of Bristol. And her main work is central banking financialization, how Eastern Europe became subprime. And she's written billions of very influential articles on the arcana of finance, from shadow banking to repo, but also on the IMF and development. So she's straddling the links between the intricacies and technicalities of global finance and what that means for the people both in the North and in the global South. We're thrilled to have a probably engaging discussion between the two of them. We will have the system like we did this morning. So first, Chibuike Uche will talk for half an hour, and then we have 15 minutes of individual questions to him, and then Daniela will take the floor. Thank you so much for being here, for presenting your ideas here. I will do the presentation for you, and you make me a sign, huh? Chibuike, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this event. And I thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation for me to come and present my paper. I will be sitting down and making this presentation because when I came, I asked them, well, what's the difference between a keynote and an ordinary speaker? They say, well, you can sit down as a keynote. I said, so well, I'll sit down as a keynote. Well, sorry, I mean, he will be navigating it. Essentially, my talk today will be on Nigeria, British economic interests and the Sterling Guarantee Agreement. And essentially, I'm looking at reserve management in post-independence Nigeria. And essentially, I'm looking at reserve management in post-independence Nigeria. And essentially, my definition of, I'll be looking at sovereign reserve management. When does a country have sovereign reserve management? And my definition, because of my training, I'm trained as an accountant. And when I trained as an accountant, 2 + 2 was still 4. I don't know what it is now. But, and as an accountant, you have to look at the facts. And that's why I take a case study approach to look at this topic, especially in a very contentious world with all these talks about neo-colonialism, external control. So let us look at the facts by looking at one case study of reserve management in post-independence Nigeria. As you know, Nigeria is the most populous African country. It is also the largest African economy, at least that's what we are told officially. Right, and so it's an important example to look at. And I believe that also Nigeria got a central bank in 1959, and by 1962 it had amended the act to become independent, and essentially controlling all aspects of reserve management. And I will show that to you. So my definition is simple: any country that by act, by law, has the right to manage its reserve as it wants to do, has reserve management sovereignty. That will be my working definition today. Irrespective of whether you make poor decisions or not with that right, it's a different matter. Whether you decide to outsource it to a third party, a third country, is a different matter altogether. So we'll look at this and then look at indeed how this plays out in the context of colonial arguments and neo-colonial arguments about Nigeria-British relations. Okay, so essentially what we're talking about is the Sterling Guarantee Agreement, and essentially I will introduce it briefly. This was an agreement that the British government set up in 1968. In 1967, the British pound was devalued by 14%, 14.3%. And in 1960, and the British government set up this agreement essentially because it feared at that time that most countries that held British pounds as reserves would diversify from the British pound. Remember, the empire was shrinking at that time. But this was clearly, it was known at the time that Britain simply wanted to join the European Economic Community. And so therefore, they wanted a managed decline of the sterling as a reserve currency. And Nigeria at the time was not actually officially, the Nigerian naira was linked not to, Nigerian pound then was linked not to the sterling, but actually to gold. So it was a clear case of Nigerian government had clear reserve management sovereignty. And what did this agreement say? It simply says, look, we know we've been devaluing this reserve, and every time we devalue the sterling, that holders of sterling reserves lose money. But what we're saying now, continue to hold sterling reserves for another 5 years. And what will happen, essentially, is this. If for any reason we devalue the sterling against the US dollar, which was the other major currency, by 1%, and it stays at that rate for up to 30 days, we will compensate you for your reserve losses, at least most of your reserve losses if you hold our sterling. So this essentially was the agreement. And the British government set it up, and 64 countries signed this agreement. Nigeria was one of the 35 that signed a 3-year agreement and then extended for another 2 years. Okay, and so this started in 68. The agreement started in 68, was extended, and we'll see that, and then look at how this whole agreement worked at the time. Okay, so it started in 60. Nigeria signed the first agreement in 68. In 71, it was renewed for another 2 years, and then in 73, outside the agreement, the British government renewed it for 6 months. And after that also, the British government renewed it for another 6 months, and it lapsed in 1974. Okay. But after it lapsed in 1974, in 1984, and this was the premise, this is the premise of this research, the Nigerian vice president then, General Idiagbon, accused the British government of acting selfishly and cited the Sterling Guarantee Agreement that Nigeria got nothing out of it. The British government made all the gains in it, and that even after they made all the gains in it, they now unilaterally abrogated it. Okay, so I started asking myself, what actually happened? Was it that the Nigerian government, was Idiagbo right, or was it there something else? So I tried to use, in doing this research, I started looking at Bank of England archives and the archives of the Bank of the National Archives, EQ, to look at what these dynamics, what really happened in these, to try and unravel what exactly happened. So, by way of background, what was the origins of the Sterling Guarantee Agreement? And I'll just say quickly that, look, this had to do with Sterling area countries. In the 19th century, for instance, the empire was huge, and then the British government designed this whole Sterling area countries, essentially countries that were closely mainly Commonwealth countries, or countries with extensive relations with Britain, and then they decided where they tied their currencies to the British pound, and they became Sterling area countries. For the British government, essentially, this enhanced trade with these colonies. Okay, it enhanced more trade with them, it removed exchange rate risks, and of course, they had special trading agreements. Okay, but it is important to note at that time, for instance, when all this was happening, Nigeria was not a colony. Nigeria later became a colony, and then even after it became a colony, they set up the West African Currency Board. So Nigeria did not have sovereignty and was not part of this. This didn't happen. Okay, this wasn't affected at this stage, and this background doesn't really affect our study, the present study. So essentially, what we now had, but over time, for instance, the empire began to decline, diminishing empire, and then, and of course, it became more difficult for the British government to manage it. Their control of the world economic system, the world trade system, the world currency system was being challenged. In 1931, for instance, there was a devaluation of the sterling. And whenever this devaluation happened, countries that had their reserves in sterling lost money. Okay, so in 1944, the Bretton Woods, America pushed, which was then the largest holder of gold reserves, pushed for the dollar to be tied to the gold, to be convertible to gold. And that became a new basis. So a major currency arose to challenge the British sterling as the key reserve currency. And then what happened was that by 1955, actually, the US had overtaken Britain as the key. The US dollar had become the major reserve currency in the world. And clearly, the UK was on the decline. But in 1949, again, they had also devalued their currency. At that stage, there was a lot of devaluation, a lot of diversification away from the sterling, mainly from non-sterling area countries. Okay, at the time. So the sterling area countries kept faith. Most of them kept faith with the British government. But then what was the British strategy? At that time, Britain also realized, this is just a bit of background, that Britain realized that their future increasingly lay within Europe, not outside, not with the sterling area countries. But of course, that was also a problem for entering Europe. They were not, although they were invited, they were not one of the key main signatories for the initial European treaties. In 1961, of course, they made an application to join the EEC. But that failed because I think it was vetoed by de Gaulle. In 1967, they wanted again. And the key argument was this, that Britain was so involved, extensively involved with the outside, that it was a problem for to be admitted into the European Economic Community because of their extensive involvement. So the elephant in the room was the role of the sterling in outside Europe. And so it was clear that Britain had now an incentive to enter the European Union, European Economic Community, and part of that required that they divest, they reduce the external role of the sterling in doing that. And then, so when they essentially devalued their currency in 1967, that was also part of the game. And then that devaluation in Nigeria lost about 8 million, Nigeria lost about 8 million of its reserves in that 67 devaluation. So that was the basis of this sterling guarantee agreement. So continue to hold your currencies in your reserves in sterling, but continue to hold your reserves in sterling, please. But at that time, it was clear that what Britain was doing was clearly a managed decline of the sterling. And it was public knowledge that Britain was doing a managed decline of the sterling. At the time they were negotiating this, there were three men, and that the British, of course, were negotiating with Nigeria. And there were three contentious issues in the negotiations. One, Britain designed this policy to save itself from drastic diversification from the sterling. But it wanted also to sell it as a product to help develop, to help sterling area countries. And it wanted to wanted them to pay a charge for using this policy. Nigeria, of course, opposed it. At that time, I mean, Africans had good technocrats at that time that opposed this. Then another issue, of course, was the issue of what was to be guaranteed, how much of the reserves had to be in sterling. And I think after negotiations, Nigeria said, well, we can only put 60%. And whether regional currencies, regional reserves would be in sterling. And Nigeria also, the reserves of the regional government, Nigeria also resisted that fact. They didn't want that to also happen. But all through these negotiations, Britain said very little, what Susan Strange calls the conspiracy of silence, about their real intentions. But it was publicly known about that this was clearly, the move was essentially to join the sterling zone. But that wasn't the only reserve loss. Remember that because of the relationship, the perception of Nigerian pound being close to the British pound, once the devaluation happened, Nigerian pound was not devalued, but what that meant was that people in anticipation that Nigerian pound would be devalued also began to divest their investments in Nigerian pound. So there was further runs on the Nigerian pound, which of course reduced the sterling, which of course reduced the reserves of Nigeria. Okay, so what was the background to pre-1968 Sterling area agreement? Okay, what was the background? So essentially, what I just have to say here is that between 1912 and 1959, we had the West African Currency Board, which was not actually a monetary authority, which was totally dependent, controlled, headquartered in London, had limited money creating ability, but essentially created a currency that was tied to the British pound that facilitated trade with the UK. That was what was in place. So this was not the time we were looking at. In 1959, Nigerian Central Bank was set up, but again, it was set up by, the act was written by a year before independence by the Bank of England, and this ensured that even though there was a central bank, they were given zero autonomy over reserve management, and that was supposed to last for 5 years. But this, of course, changed in 1962. That act was amended, and Nigeria took control. And essentially, that act, they now linked the Nigerian pound from the sterling and linked it directly to gold. Okay, and then took all the reserve management powers. And at that stage, Nigeria became a sovereign in terms of reserve management. Okay, so at that time, Nigeria essentially became a sovereign in terms of its reserve management. But now what you had going at that time was then, because of the origins of this sterling guarantee agreement, Britain clearly began to reduce the minimum sterling proportion. Initially, it had started at 60, then it was reduced at the next time, and then by the time it was ending, it was in the 40s. Okay, and Nigeria consistently accepted these kinds of things. So I did not see anywhere in the records I looked at least Bank of England records and the National Archives record and the National Archives UK records. Unfortunately, I also looked at official reports of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Unfortunately, the Nigerian Central Bank does not have an official archive, but I looked at the official reports and some Nigerian press reports, and I did not see anywhere that that these were not voluntary agreements. Okay, because you could see clearly the negotiations were mutually undertaken, and the discussions were mutually. The agreements were mutually done. Okay, so by 1975, actually, the agreement had actually lapsed, and the British government said, "Okay, no more renewal." Then Britain was already part of the European Economic Community, so and this agreement had lapsed. Okay, and this was now when it lapsed now, and it was 10 years later that the Nigerian Vice President was referring to this agreement, saying that Nigeria got nothing out of it and Britain ended it unilaterally. The evidence I have provided so far shows that Britain did not end it unilaterally. From the beginning, it was an agreement that was supposed to last 5 years. It ended up lasting 6 years. Okay, so there was no end, and the evidence also shows there were clear negotiations all through this process. Okay, now let us look at reserve management. Two events that happened and how Nigeria responded to it. In November, we know that in August 1971, the US, for instance, unilaterally made the dollar a fiat currency, that is, removed the convertibility to gold. And this essentially brought a lot of problems to the global, the international monetary system. And then how did Nigeria react to this? How did Nigeria react to this? We know that internationally there was, in November, there was the Smithsonian Agreement in November, essentially which most of the developed countries agreed to devalue their currencies, to allow the US dollar to be devalued against their currencies, essentially. But Nigeria, of course, remember that Nigeria now, the Nigerian currency was linked directly to gold, but Nigeria refused to devalue its currency. So this is clear monetary policy, clear reserve management independence. And if you also look at, I'm not discussing whether it was a good choice or a bad choice. If you also look at it, 1974, again, the Central Bank of Nigeria started to deliberately appreciate the value of the naira against all the other major currencies. And essentially, remember that with the Smithsonian Agreement, essentially, Nigeria automatically became, was linked to the dollar because of the Smithsonian Agreement. But Nigeria started devaluing. And then they made, in the Nigerian reports, they made clear arguments. Said, look, we have to do this. We have to essentially devalue, we have to revalue our currency, appreciate our currencies, because our balance of premier problems are not the same with the US. Okay, and then what was the incentive? The incentive was that Nigeria had found oil, and oil prices were rising, and Nigeria saw this as a good opportunity. Okay, but then of course, when the problem is, when you appreciate the value of your currency, because they said, well, oil prices in any way were determined not by local dynamics, but by the international market. But that, of course, affected development of local industries outside the oil industry. So we're not talking about the choice. I think it was a poor choice, but we're talking about reserve management sovereignty. And I think clearly, this clearly showed that the country had, again, clearly had reserve management sovereignty at the time. Okay, so these are the two events. Then let us now look at the post after the Stirling Guarantee Agreement ended in 1974. What happened? Nigerian reserves continued to rise because of the oil rents, and essentially, so the Stirling Guarantee Agreement had ended. Then Nigeria reserves. So Nigeria, okay, Stirling said, okay, we're no longer guaranteeing anything. But once it ended, Nigeria became the greatest holders of sterling reserves all over the world. As other countries were divesting, Nigeria was actually increasing its holding of sterling reserves. Okay, so, and it started increasing its essentially holding of sterling reserves. Okay, so, and became the greatest holder of sterling reserves. In 1975, there was a coup in Nigeria, and then the economist who was central bank governor was replaced by a journalist who was now Chiroma, who became the new central bank governor. These are part of the policy choices that governments make, and this, of course, in one way or the other, may have affected reserve management policies at the time. But this is actually when it gets interesting. Then in 1976, there's a well-documented practice in, remember at that time, for instance, even the Smithsonian Agreement had collapsed, and then we had entered a period of managed float. And that simply meant that all the major currencies were floating around. And essentially, in 1975, there was a curious practice in Nigeria. Essentially, what the Nigerian government had done was to fix, Nigeria was essentially using two main currencies in its trade, the dollar and the pound. And then they fixed this cross rate. They fixed the pound and dollar at a cross rate. That was pegged administratively. And while so it was the link from the real exchange rates. So essentially what they had done was to create an arbitrage situation where essentially the real exchange rates between these two major countries was different from what Nigerian government did administratively. So they created opportunity for people, for economic interest, to begin to exploit this system to earn arbitrage profits. So if, for instance, the dollar was overvalued against the sterling, then essentially if you got your monies if you changed into dollars, then you could get much more. And this created a huge arbitrage profit for the Nigerian government. This again was is part of the reserve management. What it shows is not reserve management on the development, but it's not reserve management. It shows reserve management sovereignty, but it shows, of course, poor judgment, reserve management incompetence, or poor management of reserves. That's what essentially this essentially shows. So another interesting area of this was, at the time, Nigeria, the Stirling Guarantee Agreement had ended, okay, and Nigeria was still betting with sterling. And in Nigeria had a director of research, Falegon, who went to London, and he had discussions with people at the Bank of England. And he told them, oh, don't worry, that Nigeria has faith in the sterling, that the sterling will bounce back, okay, based on the Nigerian analysis, okay, which of course they didn't talk to him, but in their internal report, if the people he went to, well, the people in the British Bank of England Research Department say, well, that this simply shows that the Nigerians have no understanding of the workings of the UK economy. They rely on international reports, and they are poorly staffed, and they can't even do the analysis. So they have done our job. We don't even have to defend the sterling. But so it was clear to them that the Nigerian analysis of the UK government, of the UK economy was wrong. And this, again, in my view, is evidence of reserve management, reserve management incompetence or poor reserve management. So in 1976, it is interesting to note that the sterling, the UK government decided to encourage the devaluation of the sterling again. In 1976, and by 1977, actually, the UK government began to actively discourage countries from holding the sterling as a reserve currency. But despite this, Nigeria was also holding sterling. And in fact, this essentially, and this was simply because of its poor internal mechanics. All these poor administrative mechanics, poor response time to real-time economic issues. Okay, so, and this, in my view, again, is poor, had to do with poor reserve management. Okay, but then in 1980, and it got to a stage where the UK government now started to now warn Nigeria to stop holding the sterling as reserves. You don't hold our money currency as reserve. And then Nigeria was, oh, sorry, because of what we needed to buy, we had to hold some proportion, but we'll do all our best to reduce it. So there is evidence of this in the archives that the UK government actually actively wrote fierce letters to the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, both from the governor of the Bank of England and the deputy governor of the Bank of England. We don't want you to hold our reserves again. Don't hold sterling reserves. We are not selling, it's no longer a reserve currency. But they continue to hold it, they continue to bet in this currency. Poor reserve management on the part of Nigerian government, despite the sliding value, they continue to hold onto this currency. Then, in conclusion, my conclusion will be simple. Okay, so what we've tried to do is to look at a real case study of reserve management in a sovereign state, and they link it from all this new colonialism talk, and then look at the real data, the real evidence. And what we see in the evidence is not evidence of any neo-colonial control. What we see in the evidence is evidence of poor reserve management on the part of the Nigerian state. That is what the evidence tells us, and I'd like us to be driven by the evidence in this kind of analysis. But again, these kinds of studies and detailed analysis, maybe it's again because of my my accounting training. So, and essentially, so I've tried to show this across two regimes, the Sterling Guarantee Agreement and even post-Sterling Guarantee Agreement. And in fact, it was not until the Nigerian economy, the oil lost its main value and the Nigerian economy ran into crisis that this no longer became an issue. And there was also no need for the British government to warn the Nigerian government again. I think on this, and on this note, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that is an argument that will probably provoke some questions. I will take 3 in a row, collect them, and then so Arndt, Harry, and then the final settlement person. Please introduce yourselves if you haven't yet. It would be nice to know who's speaking. It would be great. Thanks. Next round.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Arndt Hoffmann from Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Brussels. What concerns me with your explanation of what historically has happened in Nigeria, and in particular with concern to the reserve management, is that you just say it has been poor reserve management. So is it because, I'm interested in the reason why these decisions were taken. Is it because these people who were concerned or were in the office to do this research management thing were incapable, were not properly educated or skilled for this job? Or what I assume is that there were certain interests, certain hidden interests maybe from the Nigerian government side to follow this policy that later turned out to be a poor reserve management. So I actually want to ask you, what do you think are the reasons for that? I have somehow refused that this is simply stupidity or neglect, or so that there's individual failure, so to say, to blame for this situation. I assume that there are some hidden interests, and what do you think might these interests be?
Okay, Harry and in the back. And I'll also take a Fatih. There you are.
Thank you very much, Uche, for a fascinating presentation. I've got a small question and a larger question. The small one is when you refer to the exchange rate within the Sterling Guarantee Agreement, I wanted to know which exchange rate is that referring to, because the UK government at the time was defending a fixed exchange rate with the dollar, which is why they devalued in '67. So when they're talking about fluctuations of 1% in the exchange rate with the dollar, where are they measuring that exchange rate? I think that would be quite an interesting question. And secondly, I wanted to press on this narrative that this was about the UK managing the decline of sterling, because it sounded to me as if the UK is essentially bribing Nigeria to keep holding its reserves in sterling and not to give them up. And this question of integration with Europe, possibly at some point, and I know it normally doesn't matter in the UK whether Labour or Conservative are in power, but when it changed in this period, they did change their policy on on European integration. So yes, those questions about the motivation from the UK side during this and how that might have changed.
Sorry, it was him. Yeah. And the others are for the next round. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, say your name, maybe.
My name is Ricardo. My question is, the purpose of this conference is the quest for monetary sovereignty. And monetary sovereignty is, in a sense, the ability to convince other countries to hold our currency and our debt in their portfolios. And a funny thing about, not funny, but about your presentation was that it seemed that England didn't want that much monetary sovereignty, because they were trying to convince Nigeria to not hold their currency, which was like Nigeria holding British pounds as reserves was kind of like giving a 0% loan to Britain, right? I was wondering how would that be possible in concerning this conference. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think the first question is quite an interesting question. And I think what the evidence shows from the archive is, part of it is, that the Bank of England archive is, part of it is that they said, well, that the research department of the Nigerian Central Bank was so thin that they could not cover the extensive review of British economy. That was one. But you ask more interesting question, whether there were other hidden interests. And essentially, I see, if it were now, I'll tell you, well, the arbitrage maybe was not by chance. the arbitrage opportunities, those policies, for instance, that created arbitrage opportunities, maybe people exploited it. I do not, I believe people exploited it, but I do not have evidence to show that, I don't know, central bank officials deliberately did that to exploit it. Maybe if we were today's Nigeria, I will tell you, I will bet my glasses they did. But I don't know, the Nigeria at the time, I don't know, there's no evidence. I believe it was exploited because it made no sense to set such an administrative rate. And in fact, the evidence shows that it was being exploited by commercial, the banks were exploiting it. But whether it was just smart bankers exploiting a loophole or whether it was a loophole designed so that small bankers and central bankers could make profit from it, I am not very sure. And then essentially, Harry, the first question you talked was about managing. Sorry, I didn't get your second question about managing reserves. Sorry, the second one. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes. I think essentially the sterling guarantee. Look, after the 1967 devaluation of the UK sterling, okay, after the 67 devaluation against the dollar, Nigeria, for instance, lost a lot of money. Nigerian government, not just Nigeria, those sterling area countries that maintained most of their reserves in the sterling lost money, and essentially at that time, the sterling relationship with the sterling area countries was an issue in UK's admission into the European Economic Community. And so it was clear that the sterling area, UK had to divest from the sterling area countries. But what that had to do was that with this kind, if that was done suddenly, then there would have been a run. And that wasn't in the interest of UK. So essentially this was a kind of a stopgap policy to ensure that there was a managed decline of the sterling. Of the foreign holdings of sterling reserves. And it was, from the beginning, it was clear that this policy was for 5 years. So it was just a managed policy for the distance. Then in 1967, the devaluation was actually devaluation. The devaluation was actually the devaluation against the US dollar. And that is essentially why a lot of the countries lost money in that. Then the last question essentially talked about that actually what England was doing was saying, okay, don't hold our currency and become sovereign. I think you are right to some extent, but it must be looked at in the context of why that was so. And essentially the context was simple. UK now wanted to integrate more into the European Union, and a stumbling block to that happening was essentially its engagement with sterling area countries. And that, of course, if you look at why de Gaulle, for instance, vetoed UK's 61 and 67 application, that was a major problem. Said that in itself was sabotaging the European Union, that UK had a much wider a world view instead of the European view of economic development. And that what was needed was actually an European view of economic development. So this divestment, maybe it was an unintended consequence of this divestment, was actually attaining monetary sovereignty for, reserve management sovereignty for some of these local, some of these other countries. But of course, we should also always look at the counterfactual. What was the counterfactual of it? If the reserves were not in sterling, where would it have been? Or were not in foreign currencies? These reserves were not in foreign currencies. Where would such reserves have been? But that, I guess, is a debate for another day.
Okay, we'll have another round of questions, and then at the very end, since this session is 2.5 hours long in theory, there's also going to be another round of questions to both of them after Daniela's talk and her questions. The translator from French to English urged me that any French-speaking people here in this room please ask their questions in French, because there's, they need something to do. So please, French speakers, ask in French. So Fatiha, and then the two of you, please also introduce yourselves. Thank you.
Merci. Donc, Fatiha Talaït, chercheur au CNRS à Paris.
Can you bring him a French translator thing? Translation thing? He needs a translation. Sorry about that. Everybody needs to be happy. Is there a translator for Chibuike? Yes, great. Thank you.
Alors, c'est une question.
Donc, Fatiha.
C'est une question à propos du management des réserves et du faible management. D'abord, ce constat, il risque d'aller dans le sens des autorités françaises de dire qu'il vaut mieux leur confier la gestion des réserves, puisque les pays en question ne savent pas les gérer. Donc ça, il faut faire attention. Et moi, il me semble que le problème, parce que si c'est une question d'incompétence, c'est pas normal que ce problème ne soit pas réglé à la longue. On va pas supposer quand même que ces pays, que ces gens n'ont pas suffisamment d'intelligence pour faire des choses contre leur intérêt. Et donc, il me semble que c'est plutôt cette question d'incompétence, mais c'est surtout l'absence d'apprentissage et l'absence d'accumulation de l'apprentissage. C'est-à-dire que moi, quand j'essaye de travailler sur comment sont gérées les banques centrales des pays pétroliers, parce qu'ils vivent des problèmes particuliers, ils ont les chocs pétroliers à gérer, il n'y a pas beaucoup de littérature, et cette expérience de la gestion des banques centrales de la monnaie par les pays pétroliers, elle est écrite nulle part. Si je prends le cas de l'Algérie, il y a une gestion discrétionnaire de la banque centrale. Ils ne publient pas il n'y a pas de publication. La principale différence, c'est que quand on regarde par exemple la Banque de France ou la Banque de l'Angleterre, il y a énormément de publications, ils font des travaux, ils réfléchissent, ils analysent, et ils accumulent un savoir en fonction de leurs propres objectifs. Nos banques centrales, elles publient rien, les gouverneurs changent et ils ne laissent pas de traces. Et bon, il y a aussi les injonctions politiques qui font que les gouverneurs sont soumis aux politiques et que dans les pays pétroliers, il y a de gros enjeux, il y a beaucoup d'argent, il y a beaucoup de corruption, donc il y a des injonctions. Ce qui fait que c'est pas, à mon avis, une question d'incompétence, c'est une question d'accumulation de connaissances et d'apprentissage par rapport à une situation particulière qui est la gestion finalement des banques centrales dans un pays exportateur de pétrole, ce qui est très particulier.
La deuxième... Non, elle d'abord. Et après... Elle. Merci.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Je suis biologiste, je ne suis pas économiste. Et malgré ça, je vais poser ma question de toujours. Je suis tunisienne, donc je suis africaine. Lorsque je dis africaine, c'est-à-dire, je désigne pas africaine, l'Afrique du Nord et la subsaharienne et toute l'Afrique. Aujourd'hui, je veux poser la question aux gens de l'économie. Est-ce que vous ne voyez pas, messieurs, qu'il est grand temps pour l'Afrique d'unir ses sources, d'unir ses formules économiques, d'unir tout ce qui peut enrichir et tout ce qui peut avancer le peuple, ou disons les peuples africains, pour un futur meilleur, pour affronter le futur très difficile d'ailleurs par rapport aux autres pays tels que les pays qui ont des ressources pétrolières ou autres. Je crois qu'il est vraiment grand temps d'unifier notre Afrique. Et lorsque je dis Afrique, je répète, je désigne toute l'Afrique, du Maghreb, du Grand Maghreb jusqu'à l'Afrique du Sud. Et merci.
Merci beaucoup. La dernière question pour ce rond-là, parce que après, ça serait Daniela Gabor.
Oui, bonsoir chers panélistes et bonsoir à tous. Je m'appelle Merveille, je suis originaire de la République démocratique du Congo. Pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas le pays, c'est un pays qui est situé au centre de l'Afrique. Et bon, c'est aussi un pays ouvert aux investissements. Ouais, désolé. Aujourd'hui, vraiment, je suis très enrichi par différentes interventions et surtout pour les thèmes qui est très important vraiment. On sait que tous nous voulons cette unité africaine, comme venait de l'évoquer la chère dame. Moi, je me réfère toujours à l'agenda 2063, qui a été rédigé par une grande institution qui est l'Union africaine, pour une Afrique meilleure et prospère. Alors, ma question est la suivante. Aujourd'hui, le Nigeria est bien placé en termes sur le rang économique, surtout sur le continent africain. Ce sont des pays qui sont un peu, bon, on peut dire des pays exemplaires pour l'Afrique. Mais au fait, il y a un problème surtout concernant l'utilisation de nos richesses. L'utilisation de nos richesses de plusieurs pays. Étant économiste, j'aimerais savoir, surtout la partie de l'utilisation du pétrole, en vue de faciliter le commerce extérieur. Mais comment le Nigeria, où en êtes-vous avec cette utilisation? Puisque je prends aussi au Congo, il y a le pétrole, il y a l'Angola aussi, la Libye qui a été aussi qui avait aussi une puissance économique avec le pétrole. Mais aujourd'hui, on voit déjà il y a la crise qui est touchée presque dans plusieurs pays. Mais étant donné que les grandes puissances, bon, les pays qui sont développés aujourd'hui économiquement, pourquoi ne pas aider ces pays-là aussi qui sont en retard de développement? Pourquoi ne pas les aider aussi à pouvoir rattraper tous ces pays-là développés? Puisqu'on veut cette unité africaine. Quand on veut l'unité africaine, on voit vraiment, on voit du côté économique vraiment, on veut ces progrès économiques continental. Et je pense que l'avenir vraiment est dans notre continent. Même on le voit aujourd'hui avec la globalisation financière.
Poser la question?
Oui, en fait, j'ai posé la question. La question, oui, en fait, de savoir pourquoi ne pas aider ces pays-là qui ont aussi plusieurs ressources à pouvoir faciliter cet échange commercial.
Merci.
Ok.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think the first question is quite interesting. I think it talks about whether the problem is not learning, whether it's that the problem is not incompetence, it's actually learning. And I think, yes, I mean, that is one way to spin it, that yes, it's a learning curve that we can learn. That's one way to spin it. But I think when you look at it really, that this is a very straightforward thing, that if you look at reserves, you have, in this case study, they're simple. I mean, it's either you keep your reserves in dollars, or you keep it in sterling, or you keep it in other currencies, depending, of course, your trade arrangements. But of course, there's also the other option. Part of the central bank work is to advise government that, look, instead of storing up these reserves in foreign currencies, can't we invest them in strategic sectors, even if it is infrastructure to drive economic growth, for instance? And then when, of course, it comes to things like when the only reason for you to appreciate your currency is simply because of your oil rents, you forget that the oil rent that you get, actually, if you appreciate your policy, you destroy investment in other sectors, and essentially you make your economy import dependent, because your local industries outside oil, and it cannot compete. And I think part of it is also, I think it's maybe it's not incompetence, maybe it's poor, let me rephrase it, poor reserve management. I think that may be a better acceptable word there. And of course, part of it can also, over time, with learning process, we can also learn from it. I think the second question is a general question, and I think I will give the chair of this session the honor of answering that. Okay. And the third one is how how do you manage oil and how can it be used externally and in helping other African countries? I'm not sure the kind of help you have in mind. I'm not a fan of development aid because I believe it doesn't do anything, whether it's intra-African or extra-African. And I think maybe some kind of investments and that can, yes, surely maybe one area, for instance, I think Nigeria failed as a country, even with its oil wealth, was essentially failing to promote, say, regional integration in West Africa by providing, acting as a hegemon, despite the fact that the idea of the regional integration in West Africa was hatched by Nigeria simply to reduce the influence of France in West Africa. But it was, when it came to who will pay the bills of the regional hegemon, Nigeria did nothing about that. So maybe I'm not saying that would have been the right thing to do, but maybe that also could have helped reduce the external, for those of you who are obsessed about external influences in Africa, that may have helped reduce the external influence. But I think, in my view, pumping money into DRC I think it's DRC, because I think DRC has more resources than any African country you can think about. So I don't see how Nigerian or other oil money can solve the DRC problem. African problems lies internally. I think DRC can solve its problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chibuike. The question of Pan-Africanism and African unity will come up again tomorrow, and I hope we'll find a great ending, or maybe possible answer to that, or some ways to go forward at the final panel. Now it's Daniela Gabor's turn with the Wall Street consensus and the de-risking state. Have you switched it on? Okay. Daniela, the floor is yours.
I'm going to stand, although I would have liked to see Kai trying to work out when to switch my slides. This morning somebody mentioned Fidel Castro, and I want to congratulate you for now competing with the most ardent Cuban revolutionaries, because we've been in here for 10 hours listening to ideas, and we'll continue to do so. I want to talk today about the promise of monetary sovereignty. And if we understand monetary sovereignty, as this colleague put it earlier, as the ability of countries to issue debt in their own currency, then I think we should be very careful with this promise and whether it's a fake promise. Being able to issue debt in your own currency doesn't necessarily mean that things will get better for you. And there is this promise of monetary sovereignty that comes with what I call the Wall Street consensus, and I'll give you a punchline of what it is. But before I start, just to warn the translators that I tend to speak very fast. So somebody wave at me and I'll go slower. Yes? Excellent. Thank you. I'll be looking. Good. So I guess I will start by trying to keep you awake with several pictures. These will make sense. I want you to think of them as a version of a game. These will make sense, and they're all connected under the logic of the Wall Street consensus. The first picture is from last year in Ghana. A friend of mine sent it, and it says Ghana beyond aid, the role of the capital market. One picture, right? The second one is from a newspaper article here in Tunis last year, and it says there was a forum on PPPs. These are public-private partnerships. That is cooperation between the state and the private sector to finance, build, and operate companies, particularly infrastructure. And it seems that Tunisia is very excited about PPPs. There are 33 projects in the pipeline, 5.4 billion euros in play. Incidentally, I've improved my French greatly these last 2 days. And one of the main promises of the PPP agenda in Tunisia is the port in Enfida, and I'm going to use the port in Enfida to illustrate some of the points that I'm making. The third picture is from today's Bloomberg Africa, and it says that if the US and China strike a trade deal, then Africa is poised to become the land of opportunity for bond and equity investors. And the last picture is from a World Bank document on maximizing finance for development, And it says, if my Arabic is correct, but there was a translation underneath, and it says, I'm very happy that we got rid of wasteful subsidies in the energy sector, and the World Bank is very happy with the Egyptians as well. You will notice that they couldn't find an actual Egyptian to illustrate the happiness, so, yes. So they put what seems to be a middle-class woman working late at night, and celebrating the end of subsidies. I want you to remember that maximizing finance for development there talks about transformative change. It talks about capacity building, it talks about partnerships, and it talks about the private sector financing to create an energy market in a fiscally, environmentally, and socially sustainable way. Right? These are all keywords that you will find in what I call the Wall Street consensus. And this Wall Street consensus comes from the international policy community, the World Bank, the IMF, the G20, the international technocratic elite, and it basically says if we manage to maximize private finance for development, that is to tap into the trillions of, that institutional investors have in the global north and to bring them to the global south, we will solve all our poverty issues, okay? And I want to show you a clip, thinking that you might enjoy some videos after all this talking. Let's see if it works.
Okay, work with me here. Ending extreme poverty worldwide will take some $4 trillion a year. Development aid is only $330 million. Another $1 trillion comes from remittances, philanthropy, and some other sources. So we're short. About $3 trillion a year short. Seems like a really big problem. Developing countries are a $12 trillion market opportunity. Opportunities in everything, actually. Hey, challenge, just found your opportunity. So besides investors, who would it help? These people, to live a healthy life. This man, in getting a good income. Or give this woman a chance to create something incredible. And everyone else, in developing and developed countries alike. It's not just about getting private sector money into development. It's a process about when to use it, when to use public money, insurance, guarantees, or some combination that best fits. Not to replace development aid, but complement it. The World Bank Group and other development banks have the expertise to help private finance tap into developing markets, not just to invest in infrastructure projects, but in people. We call it maximizing finance for development. A little wonky, we know. And while developing countries are doing their part, it's just not going to be enough. That's why we need to rethink financing development, so this little one has a healthy life. And this woman can disrupt an industry with her product idea. And this youth, her big idea can change the world. In the end, we get strong markets and strong communities. And all of us get a world of opportunities. To learn more, check us out online.
I wanted to clarify this is not a Rosa Luxemburg video. Although I wish Rosa Luxemburg made exciting videos like this. So this is, in a sense, the poster video. It's a World Bank 2017 video. It's a poster video for what I call the Wall Street consensus. And when it talks about the trillions of institutional investors in this magic world where everything will be sorted out by Wall Street, it actually means trillions of institutional investors. As you see, estimates from, this is a private finance company, estimates of global asset under management of institutional investors and their asset managers are expected to reach $145 trillion US by 2025. And of course, the logic is if you can get some of these trillions into development projects, we will be able to finally reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay? And in order to do that, this is a quote from the Jim Yong Kim, the idea is to start to go through a process or to think through processes of how do we get the trillions of these institutional investors into developing countries, because there is not enough government funding and there is not enough donor aid money. So if the conditions are not right for private investment, we need to work with partners to de-risk projects, sectors, and entire countries. And this is critical and key to the logic of the Wall Street Consensus. I will show you the concept of de-risking. Okay? So let me take you very quickly through the quick theory and punchline. There is a paper for those of you who are interested. The Wall Street Consensus thinks about the idea and creates or imagines the idea of connecting institutional investors in the global north with SDG outcomes in the global south by creating SDG or Sustainable Development Goal assets. And the logic is you can turn sustainability into profitable business that attracts institutional investors with long-term horizons and deep pools of capital. But if we look at it through a critical lens, I will argue in this presentation, what we're seeing here is a move from accumulation by dispossession towards accumulation by de-risking. And this de-risking will be done by states in the global south with the support of multilateral development banks through the constructions of these new asset classes. And the story of PPP, public-private partnerships, is very important there. And one of the pioneers, and I'm happy there are so many Germans in the room because they have to be held accountable for this in some way, is the, no, not that one, is the KfW, the German National Development Bank, who came up with this model of de-risking development interventions in the 1970s and in the 1980s, because it argued that German development interventions that went through official lending to national development banks in the global south did not created lots of corruptions, fed lots of corruption, and did not allow for Germany to push its own development objectives. So they said, let's reorganize the KfW and let's push for this version of de-risking in developing countries. And what is important here also to bear in mind, and it's connected to the intervention of in the previous panel on the African Monetary Union, is that this logic of creating SDG assets, that is creating investable development assets, requires a structural transformation of local financial systems in African countries, in Asian countries, in Latin American countries. That is, you move away from bank-based finance towards market-based finance. That is, you reorganize financial systems around bond and equity markets, as the Bloomberg article showed you earlier, okay? And that I argue, and this is, I'm going to go through this very quickly because it's a bit, it requires too much work for which I don't have time here. That is a rethinking or a reimagining of the Washington Consensus as we know it. If you recall the Washington Consensus, the sort of policy paradigm of neoliberalism came with 10 policy prescriptions that went from how do you organize your macroeconomic policy, how do you organize your trade relationships, how do you organize your local financial system. And we see that there are mutations in the logic of this Washington Consensus, but without getting rid of its fundamental anchors. So we still have fiscal discipline in this framework. We still have central bank independence that is targeted at maintaining prices stable. But public spending now becomes an issue of de-risking infrastructure assets that are created through public-private partnerships, de-risking them for global institutional investors. And there is already an initiative in play. The G20 infrastructure as an asset class is creating the solutions for this de-risking PPP infrastructure as an asset class idea. There are also policy prescriptions that have to do with the climate crisis, and this is very important. It starts to think about sustainability reforms and how to de-risk SDG assets for institutional investors who might be exposed to climate risks. It moves into sustainable bond finance and says, let's do structural transformation of the financial system, let's do securitization, and I'll show you an example of the African Development Bank, who is a pioneer in securitization, and other types of blended finance instruments. Frauke will tell you more about this tomorrow. There is also, and here is the question of monetary sovereignty is very important, because there is a great push to move countries away from issuing dollar debt or debt in foreign currencies and to issue local currency bonds. And the G20 local currency bond market initiative, again pushed by Germany, and Frauke will tell us tomorrow why this is the case, is moving things into that direction. You will have noticed that Donald Trump is talking a lot about the problems of trade, international trade. He never talks about the problems of international finance. Financial globalization is alive and well. And privatization now becomes a question of domestic resource mobilization. For those of you who were here in the morning, the punchline here is you mobilize domestic resources in order to make sure that you create liquid domestic currency markets so you can sort of protect yourself against the volatilities of global finance. There is also a story about digital financial inclusion. This comes with the idea of integrating more and more poor from the global south into the circuits of global finance by harvesting their digital footprints. Because everybody has a smartphone, we can use those digital footprints to create financial assets. I won't have time to talk about it, but I'm happy to in the question and answer session. Okay, so this is the sort of logic. I want to, if you recall, the World Bank said at some point that this maximizing finance for development is about a process of identifying how to do maximizing finance for development. And the name of this process, they call it the cascade approach. And this is what the World Bank illustrates as the cascade approach. It says, in order to leverage private sector finance and optimize the use of scarce public resources, in other words, you will not hear an MMT story from the World Bank, you have to ask yourself the following question. Is there a sustainable private sector solution that limits public debt and contingent liabilities? And the contingent liabilities issue is key here, and I'll come back to this. So if there are no private solutions, in other words, if the private sector is not constructing the Enfida port, then there must be some problems. And to identify these problems, the World Bank says first, are there any policy or regulatory gaps or weaknesses that prevent the private sector from coming and building the Enfida port, right? I'm going to use Enfida as an example. If you take the necessary policy and regulatory measures and the private sector still hasn't come in, then it must be about risks. The balance of risk and return in constructing the Enfida port is not meeting what institutional investors would need, and therefore you need to start de-risking. The state has to take some of the risks on its own balance sheet or has to assume them in order to convince these institutional investors to come. And I have a picture of that you will not be able to see at the bottom because there is a chair there, but it starts from, if there is no sustainable private solution, then you should think about what are the regulatory gaps, and then you should think about de-risking, okay? And the aim of the exercise is to make sure that there is a public-private partnership that builds the port here in Tunisia, and that it finances the building of this port with global institutional investor money, okay? So that means first, and I found there are a couple of documents on the Port Enfida PPP that identify what are these regulatory gaps. They mostly have to do with how you organize port and maritime transport. I know nothing about that, so I'm going to not talk about it. But in terms of de-risking, I want to give you some examples of what does this de-risking state mean in terms of building the Port Enfida, right? There are 4 types of risks that the state will be asked to take on, the Tunisian state, if this PPP will go ahead. The first one is demand risk. That is, when you do a public-private partnership, the incentive for the private sector to come is to make sure that it has a constant stream of revenues. If you issue bonds in order to finance this PPP, then the incentive is even stronger because you have to make sure that institutional investors get paid. That is, the cash flow from the use of the port goes to these institutional investors. And if the cash flow is not there for a variety of reasons that have to do with demand, in other words, I'm sorry, I'm not a maritime expert, but the boats and the ships go to some other port in some other African country, then the Tunisian state will have to cover this demand risk. Then there is the political risk, and here I can give you some better examples, I guess. If the Tunisian trade unions, who are very famous for being feisty, and I heard they organized lots of strikes over the last years, if the Tunisian trade unions successfully get any government to increase minimum wages, for example, that is a political risk for this PPP project, and the state will have to pay for it. In other words, any measures that affect the cash revenues of the PPP project will have to be, the cost of those measures will have to be borne by the Tunisian state. climate risks are also important, and you will see it because they fall under either demand or political risks. In other words, if the Tunisian state says tomorrow, you know what, climate crisis is very serious, I want to regulate the financial system, or I want to regulate the broader economy, they take Fadel's very interesting suggestions and policy recommendations. If they want to regulate the domestic Tunisian economy for climate, or the domestic Tunisian financial system for climate, if that has any impact on the PPP income stream, then that will qualify as a demand risk, and the Tunisian state will have to pay for it. If there is some form of a natural disaster that affects the port, according to the PPP laws, the Tunisian state will have to treat this as a demand risk because revenues have disappeared, okay? The final risk that matters here is liquidity risk, and this takes me a bit into the conversation of how do you organize financial markets around market-based finance or around bond markets. Institutional investors who would come to Tunisia or any other African country are well aware that there are limits to the de-risking state. In other words, at some point the Tunisian state might say, I cannot cover the demand risks or the political risk. And then the institutional investors want to be able to leave Tunisian assets whenever they want. That is, they want to have deep liquid markets so they can come in as easily as possible, and that's where there is a demand put on the Central Bank of Tunisia to make sure that it preserves the price of these financial assets until institutional investors can leave, right? It's trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle to make sure that institutional investors who come here are fully de-risked from these sets of risks. So that's on what is the state expected to do in terms of de-risking for these PPP assets. On the structural change in the financial system, in order to be able to issue bonds to finance a PPP project or any other large infrastructure project, and to create liquidity in the bond markets where these bonds trade, you have to build not only local securities markets, but you have to change fundamentally the financial architecture or the plumbing of these markets. And you have to create what are called repo or wholesale funding markets and derivative markets, and you have to give investors some signals of how this could work. And the multilateral development banks, and in Africa, the African development banks, are talking about the securitization of infrastructure loans, and I'll show you an example of that, in order to pave the way for the creation of these local capital markets, okay? And you'll say, okay, this sounds very theoretical. Let me give you some examples of other African countries where these risks materialized and the state was on the hook. And the first example is Nigeria. Nigeria has a PPP project called the Azura Power Plant. It was given into operation, I think, in 2018, so that was last year. And I first heard of it in September of this year, in September 2019. The Nigerian Central Bank organized with the World Bank in Abuja a conference on maximizing finance for development in Nigeria. And one of the things that came out of there was the World Bank advising Nigeria, and for some reason that I don't understand because I'm not so familiar with the Nigerian context, but Nigeria is very close to the World Bank these days. It wants another loan. And the Minister of Finance at that conference argued that yes, PPPs are the solution for maximizing finance for development in Nigeria. And just to note, if you think PPP is an obscure sort of idea that comes from the World Bank, well, it's an obscure idea with very powerful institutional implications, because almost every country that I know of has an own PPP office in the Ministry of Finance or in the Ministry of Industry. So, and the mandate of this PPP office in every country is to push as many PPP projects as possible. So, and the World Bank President, Vice President for Africa, argued in the very kind of logic of the maximizing finance for development that with the private sector participation, Nigeria would be able to leverage government resources to bridge the infrastructure gap. And he argued that we have supported and seen success in transport, energy, and power sectors using PPPs. And the Azura Power project is an example of how we have attracted private sector investment in the power sector, right? So Azura PPP in September 2019, that was, we're in November, right? So it was two months ago, was given as an example of a successful PPP. So I thought to myself, Is there an example of a successful PPP? Because if you read the literature, there aren't many. I thought, why would Nigeria get one? And it turns out Azura is not the example of a successful PPP, quite the opposite. So let me read you here a newspaper article about the Nigerian power sector. And it says, the payment problems in the Nigerian power sector were thrust into spotlight in March of 2019, when 4 generating companies filed a lawsuit against the government and Azura. So we have here private sector companies suing each other and the government for the way in which the PPP Azura project was structured. And it was structured with a loan from the World Bank for the Nigerian government to assume demand risks on behalf of Azura. So if Azura did not get paid for the energy that it generated, and Azura is a very big plant and it generates much more energy than the infrastructure in Nigeria can actually accommodate, that state-owned infrastructure. And because of that, the Azura claimed money from the Nigerian government, and it got money from the Nigerian Central Bank, who has a dedicated line in order to pay for, to cover demand risks in the energy sector. But it turned out that it only had so much money to cover demand risks in the energy sector, so the Nigerian government ended up taking money from some private companies to give it to the Azura PPP, right? And I'll leave you with this quote of how do we measure the success of a PPP project in Nigeria. If the central bank wasn't paying, the system would collapse, right? So demand risk covered by the state here very clearly. A new power PPP, the QI plant, would enter a system that is illiquid and insolvent. This is how PPPs were built in the Nigerian energy system, in a system where the liquidity is being provided by the central bank, and without it, the PPP would basically would have to stop functioning. And this is very important because in PPP law and in PPP contracts that are typically written by very clever European or American lawyers, if you do not meet your risk commitments and if you do not cover the demand risks, then that company can take you to an ISDS court in The Hague and force you to pay there. And if you look at the IMF agreement with Ecuador this year, Ecuador is taking money from the IMF in a loan that Tunisia knows very well how it works, right? IMF loans never come neither cheap nor free. So Ecuador took money from the IMF to pay Chevron, or now Texaco, because Chevron took it to an ISDS court in The Hague and forced it to pay compensation for Chevron actually having spilled oil in indigenous communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon. It's quite outrageous if you think about it, but this is how these ISDS courts work. They allow private companies to take states for compensation. Okay? So that's an example of demand risk in PPPs with Nigeria that the de-risking state will have to cover. Then there is, I think, the more problematic issue, because these demand risk questions were known for a very long time in the PPP literature. The more problematic issue here is that the Wall Street or institutional investors have woken up to the fact that we live in a climate crisis. And the climate crisis means for them stranded assets. In other words, some assets will become stranded because of climate events. And it is possible that regulators as well will start waking up to the idea that you have to make sure that you penalize carbon financiers. If you lend to high carbon activities, then you will be punished one way or another, because the private financial system is so powerful and its lending to carbon activities means more climate problems. So what we are seeing now in international communities, particularly the conversation particularly in Europe, not so much in the US, is what I call a Wall Street climate consensus. And that is Wall Street basically working out how to deal with the climate crisis. And the first rule of this consensus is to decide, for Wall Street, that is for private finance, to decide what is brown and what is green when it thinks about assets, right? Instead of the state deciding that, they come up with private taxonomies, that is ways of identifying the greenness or the brownness of a loan or of a corporate bond or of an equity that you hold. And there is a taxonomy that is becoming more and more popular called the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance approach. The second step of this Wall Street consensus is to link the ESG framework with the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you lead institutional investors like PIMCO or other large asset managers who are very powerful in global finance, what they say is that SDGs are great. We're really excited about sustainability because we can start to think about our own environmental, social, and governance taxonomies within the framework of SDGs, right? So I will show you in a second how that works. So once you make the rules of what is green and what is brown, once you can sell it to governments as a question of sustainability, then you can also start convincing governments who are worried about the climate crisis that what is necessary is for private finance to get some subsidies in order to issue more green assets, right? So to create more green loans, to create more green bonds, you need the state to help you, and that typically happens when the central bank gives preferential treatment to these assets, to these green assets, through its monetary policy framework or through the regulatory treatment of these assets. So the state subsidizes what I would argue are greenwashed financial instruments, greenwashed bonds or greenwashed loans, because if you let private finance decide what is green and what is brown, the incentive is to make everything green and very little brown, right? And this, in the framework of the overall Wall Street consensus that I've shown you, where we revive the idea of the state because we want the state to de-risk, what we will see is the worst combination for the climate crisis that I can think of, which is you get private greenwashing and socialized costs. The state will pay for the ability of the financial system to avoid greening itself, like deeply and meaningfully greening itself. And going back to the logic of risk, these distributions of risk that will be written in PPP contracts will mean that the physical risks of extreme climate events would morph into demand risks, right? So that the investors in the Enfida plant will be protected. And if the Tunisian state wants to regulate private finance or to green private finance, it will be treated as a political risk. Okay. I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to now show you how fast I can speak. No? How are the translators doing? Okay, so I want very quickly, why is this ESG framework? If you haven't heard of it, I will suggest you start hearing about it, because this is the next new thing in international finance. There are arguments that everybody is embracing ESG investing. The head of Deutsche Bank Assets called it a tsunami of ESG is coming towards us, and whoever is not prepared will drown, which is a strange analogy to make, but that's it. I think we've seen from the chairing these 2 days that Germans do have a strange sense of humor. So there is an argument that we have at least $5 trillion US assets invested in ESG, right? And what do we mean by this ESG? It's a way of computing the climate risks of a particular financial asset, and that starts by getting data on for each company that is issuing debt on climate change, carbon emissions, pollution, resource efficiency, biodiversity, on human rights, labor standards, health, safety, everything you can think of. And then on G, which is very important, corporate governance, corruption, rule of law, treatment of labor is not here on the list, but it typically is included, institutional strength and transparency. So the gender too, everything is in there. It's the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And this, for the Marxists in the room, should be a warning sign that somehow our big corporations are waking up to the necessity of treating its workers and the environment better, okay? And once you do that, you compute an ESG rating, right? So you take all the complicated indicators that you've done, you compute an ESG rating, and I'm giving you here an example, I don't know if you can see it, from FTSE and MSCI, who are two providers of ESG ratings. And what is interesting about this example is that, let's take this company here, right? This company here, according to MSCI, is doing very well. Let's call it Tesla, right? So according to MSCI, is doing very badly, right? But according to FTSE, is doing very well. The same here. A company that is doing very, very badly on one ESG rating is doing very well on the other. Now, if you're a private financial institution, this looks great to you, because if the regulator comes to you and says, I want to tax you for your brown assets, you say, well, but look, it's not brown, it's green. Or you go here, if you don't like that one, and say, look, it's not brown, but it's green. And we see this is becoming more and more important in international development conversations, the issue of ESG ratings. And if you read carefully institutional investor documents on it, they recognize that there is subjective and conflicting ways of computing these ESG ratings, and that this often leads to greenwashing, right? So remember, rule number 2 of the Wall Street Climate Consensus is you make up your own rules, because then you can game these rules very easily. We know that a lot of greenwashing is happening via the ESG framework. Here, I'm just showing you the example of the 3 largest asset managers in the world. BlackRock, who is 3 times as big as the largest global bank we have. It has $7 trillion assets under management. That is the combined GDP for 1 year of Germany, France, and the entire Eastern Europe. And BlackRock claims to be a big climate fighter. Like if you read the emails and the letters to investors of its head, it says we really worry about climate change and we will fight to oppose it and to slow it down. But in practice, what they do is that they do their best to make sure that climate measures are not implemented, right? And here the example is of the 3 top asset managers voting against key climate resolutions at ExxonMobil, Duke Energy, Ford, General Motors, and Dominion Energy. These are all fossil fuel companies or high carbon companies. We also have the provider of MSCI ratings has including in its top 10 constituencies of an ESG index investment. I don't want to bore you with what that is, but it has included JP Morgan Chase, when we actually know that JP Morgan Chase is not a low carbon bank. It is the opposite. It is the bank that has funneled more than $200 billion over the last 3 years into fossil fuels, right? So very important. The ESG framework, it's a private taxonomy that allows private finance to greenwash. To conclude with this, just to say that I've given you some examples of how this Wall Street Consensus is evolving. If you want to read more, the World Bank has published in the last couple of years 3 what they call infrastructure sectoral assessment programs, where they map out what these infrastructure sectors would need to do in order to maximize finance for development. Therefore, Egypt, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, I don't have time to talk about it, but they are literally, in the case of the Egypt, I think it's quite interesting because it says it wants to take the vestige of the developmental state in Egypt, the National Investment Bank, and to reorient it to guaranteeing foreign currency positions of institutional investors. 2 more minutes. 1 more minute. Very quickly, and I'm going to tell you all about complicated market-based finance in 1 minute. The changing financial market structures arguments are also important. They come from the idea that institutional investors prefer particular types of assets, and we need to make sure that these assets can be created, right? And here we have the African Local Currency Bond Fund that is trying to mobilize private finance into African bond markets in order to start or to accelerate these markets. These are the institutions that are behind them. You will see my favorite villain, the KfW is there, but several others, including the UK Aid and some asset managers. And we also know that there are several policy initiatives that are pushing for the structural transformation of financial systems in the global south, from the maximizing finance for development agenda of the World Bank to the FSB shadow banking into resilient market-based finance and to the G20 local currency bond market initiative. I've written a report about this and how the first priority of this changing financial markets is securitization. I wanted to show you this, but you can ask me in the question and answer session. It is an example of how the African Development Bank has done a synthetic securitization in order to show the rest of the multilateral development banks that the turn to market-based finance and the turn to securitization is a good idea. Of course, you will see in this, I would argue it's not a very good idea. It's not a deal that makes sense for the African Development Bank, but they will strongly disagree, I'm sure. I will not go through this. Just to note that the shift to market-based finance is happening. We are seeing more emerging market borrowers issuing debt securities. And here we can see that also in the corporate bonds issued by developing countries. And why is this problematic? And this takes me back to the question of monetary sovereignty as the ability to issue debt in your own currency, is that when you issue local currency bonds, it doesn't mean that you have a more stable financial system. It can be quite the opposite, because we know that financial systems organized around capital markets are much more vulnerable to the global financial cycle that is moving with the rhythms of the US dollar. It doesn't matter whether it's dollar debt or local currency debt, you're still exposed to the global financial cycle. It also comes with the wholesale adoption of the US financial architecture. This is very important because any initiative, the local currency bond market initiative or anybody else, I asked the gentleman participating in the keynote this morning and he confirmed this to me, that what we will see there is an attempt to move from this kind of a system. Kai, I know you will kill me, but give me 1 more minute. This is the traditional bank-based financial system. This is what is the ambition to create in African countries, right? Bond markets where you can invest in SDG securities, and in order to finance and create liquidity in these bond markets, you need to create wholesale money markets or repo markets that were the basis of the global financial crisis, and also derivative markets. So very important, it is a structural transformation of local financial systems that, to my mind, is creating conditions for further systemic fragility. Yes, very quickly. This Wall Street consensus wants finance to reign, technocrats to de-risk, and politicians to rubber stamp. But there is an effective strategy against the Wall Street consensus, and that is climate. The climate crisis is offering us a political opportunity that the left has not had for the last 30 years. And this political opportunity here is articulated in what probably is the most proud moment of my life, when Jeremy Corbyn tweeted out a report that I've co-written with several other people for the Labour Party, where we argue that a green finance agenda for the UK is very important in order to have Green New Deals. You can't have a Green New Deal without greening private finance. It just simply doesn't work. And I'll leave you with this. This is what I would suggest we should be focusing our political attention on, is a green developmental state at the same time with renationalizing and taming finance by greening it. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Daniela. So, there's hopefully lots of questions and criticism or agreement. I will this time begin in the back. Patrick, Andrew, Rohan, and Peter.
An all-male question panel.
Yeah.
I know. Yes.
So thank you very, very much.
And thank you so much to the translator to translate Daniela's talk. Probably sweating.
No, thank you very much, Daniela. It's a just two-part question, because the thing I worry about when I see multiple and deep financial innovation is hucksters, scammers. They are just, prolific. And the last time we had a very serious round like this, just before the big financial meltdown of 2008 and 2009, they were certainly going hard into carbon trading. So that was going to be a $3 trillion market. Do you remember the hype, the backslapping, the privatization of the air to have a market solution to solve the market problem? And it completely crashed from 35 euros on the European Union emissions trading scheme to 390 in the subsequent decade. Now it's come back because of some tweaks. But do you not feel that it's not just a cyclical global process, but it's also a problem if excessive financialization means a lot of money is drawn in, but the bubble bursts? And then a lot of the things you're describing simply fall away because they don't make any sense. They're just not effective demand. And the second part of that, particularly for Africa, did we not have another great German innovation 2.5 years ago at the G20, Wolfgang Schäuble's compact with Africa, and Tunisia is one of the 12 victims of that, right? And where has that gone? It also, like Schäuble's, seems to have gone away. It appears, okay, they had a meeting here in Tunis 5 months ago, but there's nothing happening. And I think it might be that with the sense that global commodity prices have re-peaked and are heading down, so much of what we're looking at in this are just financiers talking up their books. I don't feel that's been a strong enough part of your wonderful work, the potential for the bubbles and the scamming and finance moving into Africa to be unveiled in the next big melt?
Just pass it on to Andrew, Rohan, and Peter.
Hi, Danielle. That was fantastic, and you're brilliant. And I think it takes 4 men to even come close to approaching you. So, I just one thing I wanted to say is like I was talking recently to an engineer who's studying PPPs in Europe, and actually saying there's a big reaction against them because they've been really criticized in Europe. There's a movement away from them in the so-called advanced first movers. And it reminds me as well with new public management as well, when the first movers in new public management were moving away from them because they created such a mess in public management, the World Bank was basically sort of like secondhand goods, passing them on through World Development Reports to developing countries and pushing them really heavily. And it seems to me that from what you're saying, this is perhaps a similar process that's going on. And I'm wondering if there's a way to tie it into as well the backlash against PPPs that's now happening in large infrastructure projects. And I think, if I'm not correct, the airport that Obrador canceled in Mexico was also a PPP.
Rohan, and then Peter.
Yeah, obviously echo what Andrew just said about four men needing to take on Daniela. I'll do my part as a quarter of the response. So I just wanted to think about the way you framed the monetary sovereignty around borrowing in your own currency. I think, at least the way that I see it, is that one of the points to be made about borrowing in your own currency, especially when it's a floating exchange rate, etc., is that the concept of borrowing there doesn't really mean anything. You know, issuing interest-earning money that can trade like a security is really what you're talking about there, because bonds and money function largely similarly there, except for the properties of the instrument you're using to finance, and that makes borrowing in your own currency closer to sort of making money and spending it and then taking it back in a tax circuit, even if it has the logic of a bond, even if it has the formal structure of a bond. And the reason I think that's significant to everything else you're saying is because I totally agree with everything you're saying, but it seems like the bigger elephant that before you get to the risks about demand risk in financing is everything has to be able to be paid back or have a monetary yield. And that seems to be the biggest limiting principle here, which is every kind of investment that can't be framed in those terms narrowly gets excluded from this framework at the outset, because it's still a logic of why am I going to invest unless I can get a yield back. Whereas if you think about things like public education, there might be social benefits that can't be measured in direct nominal yields. Or if you think about other kinds of public investments where there might be some sort of recognizable monetary benefit somewhere else in the economy, you end up having to create new structures to recoup that cost saving somewhere else and transfer it as a profit or something. You know, if you think about social impact bonds or something, this idea of, well, we're saving money somewhere over here, so therefore that can be used to repay the initial cost of investment. But that actually shapes the investment, the industrial structure of the entire economy, because suddenly you're having to connect pots of money being recouped over here with where the actual investment might be going on at the outset. So I'm just curious about, all of this seems to make sense about the risks of applying a finance approach to development finance, but does even framing the entire scope of public investment as investment financing limit the scope of discussion overall in a way that if we talked about monetary financing, we would re-expand that conversation?
Peter, and then we've closed the first round and we have many more.
So the great news, Daniela, is that I'm apparently the last of the feeble four trying to take you on. Then you can respond. I'm also going to come from actually the opposite perspective to the one we just heard, so you can tackle both wings of this as you like. So I very much get your point about gaming these ratings, and I think you've done a very good job in illustrating exactly how that is happening and how dangerous that is. I think that stands. Where I was a bit more puzzled was in your prior discussion over the Nigerian PPP. I may have misunderstood it because I don't know much about Nigeria, but if I understood you correctly, the key argument you made was that the capacity that was built into this company far exceeded any reasonable expectations of its demand, and that therefore, because it was covered by one of these guarantees, the Nigerian government ended up having to pay for that gap. and this was a World Bank supported thing. That's the last thing that I want to question here. If that is so, then what you're really pointing to, I think, is a breakdown in the World Bank's internal procedures to estimate social rates of return correctly. Whereas the prior speaker was saying you shouldn't even bother trying, I'm saying the problem is that they didn't try. They approved a project which, if simply correctly estimating its social rate of return, would have been rejected, got it covered by a PPP, so the question is, what is going wrong with the World Bank internal assessment of its social rate of return and why?
Thank you. Daniela, and then next round.
Dubious analogy because of the feeble 4. I like that. So let me start with the last one. I mean, I'm not quite sure that I understand what were the internal processes of the World Bank, but the World Bank is very clearly a big promoter of PPP. It has now because of the maximizing finance for development, but it has now two sort of main objectives or overguiding aims. One is human capital, and the other one is maximizing finance for development. And the PPP agenda within that is very powerful. And I mean, you can look at the World Bank website on PPPs. It's big. It's big. It has blogs. It has all sorts of things. And my sense is that that I would not expect the World Bank to put accurate estimations of the social cost of return as a priority in pushing a country like Nigeria in Africa down the PPP route. And of course, we also have to remember that PPPs work very well in political systems where politicians can argue, here we have large infrastructure projects that my administration would be delivering, while not actually having to pay for it and not having to account for it on the balance sheet of the state, because PPP is accounted as contingent liabilities, right? You only have to pay if these risks materialize, and then you have to pay out. And that is a way of both promising fiscal rectitude as a politician and promising infrastructure projects to get elected again. So there is a sort of a perverse incentive at play here, both on the side of the World Bank and on the side of politicians everywhere. And this gets me back to Andrew's question about the so-called death of the PPP in the first movers, sort of in the global north. I'm really skeptical that that's the case. I think it's coming back significantly, despite the criticisms that we have had in the UK, for example. I think there are, given that there is a sense of austerity still prevailing almost everywhere, the PPP solution for leveraging private finance, and it's leveraging private finance is not only a World Bank sort of international development issue. If you look at the European Union, now the idea is we need to do something about the euro because it's gone terribly wrong, and we will leverage private finance there, particularly for climate change. So the PPP, I'm not sure that is that dead. I understand that the largest number of PPPs you can find in Europe is actually in Germany. There are many Germans here, and they can confirm that. I heard that they are particularly bad in terms of, I'm not bashing Germany here. I've been to Germany recently. This is why I know a lot about German PPP, well, a little bit about German PPPs. So I'm not sure that's true, but we can have a conversation. I think PPP is a very convenient sort of escape route for governments who want to appear fiscally moderate while at the same time appearing to do something about growth. And infrastructure projects and the infrastructure agenda is very big, not only in the global south, but in the global north as well, particularly where it's crumbling, and it's crumbling in most places. Then there was the question of BlackRock, and Mexico is a great example of the power of asset managers, particularly BlackRock, in pushing PPPs, because in the administration of Peña Nieto, basically BlackRock took over almost, I would guess, I've seen an estimate, almost half of the infrastructure assets of Mexico through a variety of PPP contracts. And then within the new administration of he presents himself as a I wouldn't say far left. He presents himself as a more progressive politician, and in his campaign, he campaigned directly against BlackRock as a sort of white-collar mafia. And he said, we will put a stop to all the PPPs that BlackRock, that the Mexican state has done with BlackRock in order to regain back some of our national sovereignty. But my sense is that over the last 6 months, this determination to stop PPPs and to kick BlackRock out of the political economy of Mexico has been waning quite significantly. So I would be surprised if that's the case. In terms of the compact with Africa, I didn't have time to talk about it, but I think the sort of logic of the Wall Street consensus is there. And from the examples that I've shown you, I don't think that this is another fad through which institutional investors are coming up with the ideas that they are testing, and then if they work, okay, if they don't work, not. I think that they are deeply and increasingly hardwired into the sort of institutional discourses of most large international development actors, and it's a very nice message to send. I mean, if we are a room of cynical people here when we look at this World Bank video and we think, okay, you know, what the World Bank wants to do is to privatize any public service you can think of and somehow bundle it into a financial asset that it could sell the institutional investors in the north, which incidentally includes my pension fund as well, right? So it's a framing that to my mind is very powerful, because it says if you do things correctly, you have a very important ally, and that important ally is our institutional investors, and they are nicer, they are longer term, you don't need to worry about them in the same way that you would worry about a hedge fund or speculative investors. Whether the bubble will burst, I'm not quite sure, because the logic of de-risking also says that the central banks of the global south start to do what the central banks of the global north have been doing for the last 10 years, which is to prop asset prices, right? You do unconventional monetary policy, you basically make sure that the prices of these securities don't fall too much and start drilling holes into the balance sheets of institutional investors. And if that's the case, of course now then there is a limit to how far can the system go. I think it requires far more conversation of what are the limits, but to me there is a clear attempt here to suck up as much resources from the private sector, from the public sector as possible, and put them into the job of de-risking, because this is what we're talking about here. We are talking about a future in which most of public resources will be directed towards de-risking, ultimately bonds held by institutional investors one way or another, instead of being directed towards financing public education, public health, public whatever you want. And Rohan, we are getting into some very complex nuances of how do we want to frame things. I think we'll save it for a future conversation.
Okay, I would like to open also to questions to Chibuike, if you still have any. But we still have some time. In the program, we have until 8:30. If we have so much questions, we can go until that. But if you're getting tired and you're hungry, we can also finish earlier. I will decide based on the questions you have. Okay, Frauke and Monsieur Enrique and Fatiha and Anne.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question to Daniela and a response to Patrick, because I will mention the Compact with Africa tomorrow, and it has it plays still quite a big role, to my opinion, and I will explain tomorrow why. I have just a short question to Daniela concerning this AACB fund, which was founded by the Ministry of Development in Germany, so it's they're all over, actually. So what is the importance of this fund? Like for implementing, they're focusing on like private bonds, right? So in comparison to other government implementing government funded implementing bodies, what is their role?
Enfin, je vais parler en français. Voilà, d'accord. Alors, moi, je suis expert dans les études de transport. Ben, j'ai passé. Voilà, d'accord. Yes. No. Non, voilà. Je vais être bref. Alors, j'ai passé 35 ans à la CCFT comme spécialiste dans les études de transport. Bon, plus précisément, vous avez évoqué le port d'Enfida. Bon, est-ce que le port d'Enfida, on doit le faire? Je vais vous répondre. Pourquoi on ne doit pas le faire? Parce qu'il suffit d'aménager le port de Bizirt, de la Goulette, de Sfax et tout ça. C'est beaucoup plus important pour le transport pour la collectivité, ce qu'on appelle le bilan collectif de la société, c'est-à-dire où tout le monde en tire profit. Ça, c'est le premier point. Bon, le deuxième point, c'est un point technique. Pourquoi le port d'une villa n'est pas rentable? Collectivement, je dis bien, socialement. C'est-à-dire, c'est pas économique. Bon, parce que il y a un problème technique. Les eaux, enfin, ce qu'on appelle, disons, ce sont une mer intérieure. On sait, techniquement, les mers intérieures, ça nécessite, comment dirais-je, des fonds très très profonds pour le faire. Donc, ça c'est le premier point, avant de parler de financement et tout ça. Bon. Le deuxième point qui est le plus important, parce que...
la deuxième question.
La dernière question. Nous avons cherché l'intégration du rail avec le port. Ben, il y avait un choix. Or, la Banque mondiale nous a imposé ce qu'on appelle l'autoroute. Alors que le transport des marchandises émanant de l'Europe et tout ça est beaucoup plus rentable par rail que par la route. Est-ce que cette décision, en fin de compte, c'est une décision politique? Ça n'a jamais été une décision économique. Et c'est le problème de tout le monde. Ok, voilà, c'est ça ma question. C'est un peu...
Ok, moi je vais abuser de mon pouvoir de modérateur et aussi poser une question. Sorry, okay, I was thinking about the translator. So in the morning you asked this question to somebody else, and we discussed it last night at dinner. So I have this impression of overpowering power of finance and the IMF and the World Bank, and they can do whatever they want with the rest of the world. So that's what the impression I'm left with. So they have this amazing power through the flows of capital that they control. And the MMT approach that Fadel was laying out is basically saying, you know, with a certain degree of delinking and a shift in import structures and the domestic economy, spending more money into existence, we can actually sort of counter that overpowering power of finance. I would be curious, and because you raised the question yourself, whether you actually think that this, in times of no capital controls and the lack of capital for infrastructure investment, that this overpowering mass of capital that institutional investors now control can really not be stopped, or whether you see any slick way of, you know, reorienting domestic economies and imposing capitals, whatever, could be somehow feasible. So a little bit of a conversation between, let's say, Fadel's first discussion and what you're saying now. Okay, thanks. So, Carla? Yeah, but she already asked a question. I think Carla never asked a question. So, Carla, and then Fatiha, and then Enrique. Please, Carla first.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Daniela. I was wondering, so since in your report you mainly talk about the UK and then you briefly talked about European PPPs, I was wondering if there is maybe a different motivation for PPPs within first movers countries and the example of Nigeria, for example. And if there are different motivations, then also we need different solutions to not go into PPP. So my question is, do PPP projects in Nigeria, for example, have to do with technology that would not be there if just a government, like a nationalized project, would ask for funding or would try to fund it? So if this is a kind of conditionality that is playing into it. Thank you.
Fatiha, Enrique and Anna.
Oui, rapidement, à propos du consensus de Wall Street, c'est pas seulement la souveraineté monétaire qui est en jeu, c'est la souveraineté aussi sur le droit, la capacité d'un pays de produire son propre droit, qui est quand même la définition aussi de la souveraineté. Je me réfère aux travaux de Katharina Pistor qui montre qu'aujourd'hui c'est Wall Street qui est en train de produire le droit pour le reste du monde à travers justement ces mécanismes. Et donc ma question pose sur la perspective de renationalisation, en dehors du fait que l'expérience de gestion de services de secteur public pour les pays qui ont vécu ça, c'est pas une expérience très positive. Hein. Il y a beaucoup de pays qui ont connu un désastre, mais aussi qu'aujourd'hui, bon, par exemple dans le cas de l'Algérie, qui a encore un secteur public important, l'État n'a plus le pouvoir de prendre des décisions parce qu'il va se retrouver devant des tribunaux internationaux lorsqu'il veut, par exemple, renationaliser ou revenir sur des engagements. Donc, même la renationalisation ne règle pas le problème de la perte de souveraineté dans la production du droit et dans voilà. C'est bon, c'était une question aussi.
Anne, parce qu'elle est déjà là, et après Enrique.
Okay, I actually just wanted to make a comment coming from the ingenious country of engineers, Germany mainly, namely. I've just encountered someone who is like, hey, we have like this financing gap of the SDGs, and how about founding our own cryptocurrency to finance this? So this is, you know, just to give you another example of how ingenious Germany is responding to the SDG question.
Enrique in the very back.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on fintech, that you said you had some. And also just to confirm your remark about the smartphone market in Africa. I mean, the biggest smartphone seller is this Shenzhen company called Transsion, much bigger than Huawei or Samsung. And pretty soon, everyone will have smartphones. Certainly, a few years ago, this wasn't the case. But then, why would this be financialization? Because if it's just payment, there's no investment or savings involved. So, since finance turns money into capital, if it's just payment, it's just money, money, money. So, I don't see how the phone implies financialization.
Okay.
Let me start with the last one. So first, why is financialization? Why is this financialization just because there is a phone? I give you the example of a company that is operating, I think, in some African country. I'm sorry, I can't remember anymore. I am not as resilient as Fidel Castro, I'm afraid. But this company says all data is credit data. And the idea, or in other words, your digital footprint can be harvested from your mobile phone in order to create a source of, with the help of behavioral economics models, to create a source of information about your behavior as a potential borrower that then can be used in order to expand the frontier of who is bankable towards the poor, right? And we have seen this is happening in various places, where the idea is, okay, the poor don't have collateral, they don't have ownership of whatever houses or other things that they can pledge when they take a loan, but it's fine because we can give them a loan through their mobile phone, and we can work out an interest rate and a credit borrower profile from their digital footprint. And I've written a paper with Sally Brooks in 2017 where we talk about this idea of financialized inclusion that comes from, and it's again a push at global level by the Association for Financial Inclusion, where everybody you can think of is there, including our friends from Germany now that we are in this mode. And the logic is that somehow digital data can become a substitute form of collateral or substitute form of understanding behavior. And then it also can be used to discipline, right? Because what we're seeing is the emergence of forms of disciplining the poor via the mobile phone by, for example, telecom companies aligning themselves with fintech companies in order to monitor the behavior of the borrowers through their mobile footprint. So if you're at 2 o'clock in a bar somewhere, they will read it as an indication that you're drinking instead of sleeping and working to pay your debt back, right? And it's not that dystopic. I think it does happen. I think also there is a bigger question of the fintech is increasingly being used in order to generate digital asset classes. So, for example, I've seen examples in South Africa of health as an asset, as a digital asset class, where where your mobile phone and other digital technologies are used in order to connect you to the private health system. So I think that's an entry there. I haven't studied it enough to think about it carefully, but there is this large South African I don't know if it's a conglomerate, it's a company that provides private health services, that sells cars, it has a bank arm, and you can see how these can all be nicely combined together in order to work within this logic of financialized or digital asset classes. Cryptocurrency as a solution to SDGs, that is, I think, a dumb idea. I will not say more than this. It is impossible because cryptocurrencies, if they are not guaranteed by the state, are not going to be held for anything else than a speculative purpose. And at least the logic of SDG assets is that they have to have some stability built within from this de-risking aspect. What sovereignty is at play? I think that's a very interesting question, and in the paper that I've written to elaborate these arguments, I do quote Katarina's work, because the way in which PPPs are created, it is a form of coding capital for the Wall Street consensus. It codes a set of rules and a set of laws that ensures de-risking will occur, de-risking by the state will occur. So I think that's very important. It's not only about monetary sovereignty, but it is about the sovereignty of the state to organize its balance sheet in a way that meets a democratic or responds to democratic processes. This will not happen under the Wall Street consensus, or it will happen with increasing difficulty. And the issue of political risks, yes. To the more complicated question of is finance this all-powerful beast that we cannot fight, and should we instead be going for slick solutions like, I don't know, did you call MMT a slick solution? Yes? Okay. I don't want to upset my MMT friends. I mean, I come from the camp that thinks you cannot, if you don't understand the political forces that you want to oppose and how they operate, how they evolve, and how they mutate, working out great ideas is not enough. So I'm in the camp that thinks you have to fight on the terrain of the political struggles that are happening already. And to me, that the political struggle in the global south is so far gone down the PPP or down these Wall Street consensus lines that I think I'm very happy to contemplate alternatives, and what I had in the back on my slides was a talk of a green developmental state, and then green developmental state comes with insights that are very common to the MMT framework or any other progressive framework that says we have to reclaim the ability of the state to organize economic activity to a greater extent that it has done, particularly in the age of climate crisis. You cannot deal with a climate crisis in a just way without a big state. I'm very convinced of that. I would almost venture to say that China is the example of a state that is trying to green itself in a just way, but then I think of all the concentration camps that are running around, so I'm not going to say that anymore. But I'm convinced that this is necessary. So, can you win political battles by disregarding completely the other side? I don't think so, because the other side is moving very fast now. And I think the way in which, for the past 6 months, the logic of and the vocabulary of the Green Deal has inundated Europe. I mean, the European Commission wants a Green New Deal. I'm thinking, what? And the European Commission. It's very strange that he would say that, because the European Commission also says fiscal austerity is the most important thing and we will always defend it. Christine Lagarde has just come from the IMF and is berating countries about their fiscal positions, and also promises a Green New Deal. When this idea of the Green New Deal is mainstreamed, mainstreaming doesn't come on its own without modification. And I've heard institutional investors talking about just transition to a climate resilient economy. When institutional investors talk about justice, it worries me, because they want their justice, their version of justice, and their version of justice looks like what I've shown you, which is climate de-risking. So I want to be able and I don't think that the fact that I'm presenting this phenomena in detail, I don't want to suggest that finance is all powerful. I want to suggest that, and I've been working with civil society organizations for the last 1.5 years, so this is why I know so much. Most of them were from Germany, incidentally. This is why I'm giving German examples, not for any other reasons. And I think that this is something that that we have to understand and start opposing and start fighting against. And there is the Heinrich Böll Foundation in the US has produced a really brilliant report by Motoko Aizawa on PPPs and where they are now. And behind the scenes, the PPP agenda is gathering a crazy pace. It is quite impressive how much it has moved. And so we can have a conversation now whether delinking yourself from global finance through attractive progressive narratives is an effective way of fight or coexisting with global finance. I don't think so. I think, and I'll just remind ourselves, after 2008, I started doing interviews because I moved away from studying financialization in Eastern Europe because not many people are interested in Eastern Europe, to my great shame. I'm Eastern European. I started studying European finance, and the first time I saw a banker losing their nerve in an interview was when I was interviewing bankers about the financial transactions tax project in the European Union. And that was a unique moment in European finance in the last 50 years where France and Germany came together and said, these people are speculators, they are creating asset bubbles, they are ruining our economies, they are putting the taxpayer on the line, we have to stop them, a financial transactions tax, we have to push them, and when France and Germany wants to push things in Europe, things happen. And I was asking this banker what he thought about the financial transactions tax, like what was the most interesting thing about it, and he started to explain to me, I don't understand what civil society organizations are doing in this room on the FTT. Why are they here? Why is Attack, which is a French and German organization, why are they in this room? They were supposed to talk about poverty. Why are they talking about finance? And this to me was inspiring. I swear to you, the guy started raising his tone and losing his nerve, and I was like, oh my God, he's fine. And he was very uncomfortable because they had a set of actors that were working along principles and demanding social justice, sitting in a room with people who were doing private finance and telling them, no, the questions of private finance are questions of social justice, and we should have a seat at the table. And if we don't engage with these processes, then they can charm governments. And this is a very charming narrative. With all respect to Fadel, the MMT narrative, I don't think is as charming to developing country governments. But I'm very happy to be proven wrong because our political struggle is the same one.
Okay, Fadel. I mean, we have some time. So Fadel wants to say something? I saw another hand somewhere. That's all? Okay.
I completely agree with you. It's really not to prove you wrong, but I think that same banker who is really losing it would lose it even more if the progressive social, movements will go to them and say, listen, we're going to tax you and regulate you, not because we need your money to green the economy or we need your permission, but because you're a speculator, because you're a parasite, because we want to reduce your power and influence in politics. And we can have our Green New Deal, we can have our social justice, funded by the big green state that you're talking about. I think that's more aggressive in terms of fighting their power, because otherwise they're saying, oh, you need the money and tax revenues to fund this thing. Forget about the money and tax revenues. We'll give you green bonds. We'll do your Green New Deal with the de-risking model that they're selling to us. I think it's much more powerful to de-link the taxing from the spending and go very aggressively against the taxing to reduce their power and influence and corruption. That's even scarier to them, and that's even more empowering for us. But if we fit into their narrative and say, yes, you're the powerful, you're the one who has the money, please give us some of your tax revenue so we can have our social justice, they still have the power. And they're going to turn around and sell it to us as, a World Bank video that you showed us.
Quickly to that, I did not mean that the financial transactions tax was for civil society organizations in Europe a tax issue primarily. I mean, it was a tax issue for Germany and France because they thought, okay, maybe we really need to have some common fiscal policy and raising some revenue would be great. And if we have to do it through an FTT, it's fine. But the main reason for the financial transactions tax was to reduce speculative finance in Europe. And they organized it in a way that it would have taxed trading in bonds that were not issued by sovereigns. It would have taxed repo markets and derivative markets, almost everything in market-based finance that I discussed. So I can see the attractiveness. I'm not saying that the opposite of the Wall Street consensus is a let's tax these people because we need their money. I'm saying is let's green these people because that will shrink them.
Right. Again, I agree with you, but the same logic is used not just for financial transaction tax, for drilling taxes and taxing this to pay for that. So it's a constant loop that governments are stuck into and civil society is following, and it always empowers the group that we want to tax, right? So it's decoupling taxing, things to pay for public health or education or infrastructure is more empowering for the things that we want to achieve. So I think it's just a strategic choice. It's not against anything you said. I think I believe it's more aggressive strategy for us to do this, and I think they fear it more than the current thing because they can still hijack the current tax system and do whatever they want.
Okay, I see only Peter. Is there anybody else who still wants to ask a question? Otherwise, it's time for dinner. So, Peter, the last question.
Oh my God, now I'm stopping dinner. It gets really bad. I just want to come back to the Stirling agreement, if I can. Just ask three simple questions about it, factual. Either will or won't know the answers.
Did you say three?
Very quickly, factual.
Okay, make them quick, please.
The first one is: was it transparent at the time? Was it publicly known that the Bank of England had issued this guarantee, or was it non-transparent? You have to dig it up. Secondly, did the Nigerians get given the same offer by any other central banks? The Bank de France or somebody else who might have been hoping to be a reserve currency, but on the devaluation side. And if the CFA franc countries got given that offer by the Banque de France as well, given that they were obliged to hold their reserves in francs, which may have devalued?
Okay, I think, thank you very much. I think the first question, it was at the time, it was clearly, the depreciation was clearly transparent, and it was reported. Remember that the Sterling Guarantee Agreement was with 64 countries. It was clearly transparent. The losses were well documented by the Bank of England. So that was, it was not in dispute, or it was not hidden at all. On the second question, whether Nigeria got an offer from any other country, from what I've seen, what I saw in the archives, there is no evidence that they got any. And at that time, also, I think there were two main currencies. Remember, Nigeria was still part of the Sterling area, was a Sterling area country, and so most of its reserve was already in sterling, and it's most of its trade, because of colonial linkages, was also in sterling. There was clearly no lobby. There was no evidence of lobby, say, from the Americans to divest. Americans didn't have to do that. Non-sterling area countries were continuously divesting into the dollar. But also, remember, by 1968 also, there were also signs that the convertibility of the dollar to gold was already having problems. So I guess that may also explain why America was not in a position to pursue that. With respect to the first question about the French, I'm not sure that the French were involved in this. The French franc wasn't devalued at the time. It was just the sterling that was devalued. So I'm not sure whether this actually affected the Francophone states at the time.
Okay, thank you so much to everybody, and to Daniela and Chibuike for their arousing talks. Enjoy dinner. We see each other tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Have a nice evening.